Thank you, Stephen, and through you, Mr Mayor. The Auditor-General highlighted in her commentary that our largest and most significant risk surrounded the financial impact. What I will do is step you through and explain some of those impacts. I will do that in non-technical language in terms of what it means in the financial community. The Auditor-General made the note, and Stephen's reiterated, that the first piece is that our inability to strike the rates. And whilst the Auditor-General did correctly also note the fact that there is a provision for us to strike a percentage of last year's rates in the first quarter and invoice ratepayers for that, we can nominate a date for payment. However, we cannot enforce that date of payment. That's quite an important point to make clear, because it does lead to an impact on our cash flow. Without the LTP in place, we risk breaching a number of our covenants and a number of our debt instruments due to our inability to provide security over future cash flow. That is primarily the issue when it is financial. What that means is that it would mean that we would immediately enter what is termed a review event by our bankers and our financiers. That then leads from the next step from that point. If we are not able to remedy that review event very quickly, it leads to increased exposure to a risk of triggering an event of default. The Auditor-General also made a comment about we would need to disclose to the New Zealand Stock Exchange and foreign exchanges, being Switzerland and Singapore. The reason for that is if we trigger either a review event or an event of default, they are material adverse effects that the market must be informed of. Similarly, alongside that, we'd also be required, if our LTP is not passed, to immediately inform the rating agencies. They would most likely place us on immediate negative watch, has an effect in the market very quickly. That would follow very quickly by a rating downgrade. There are significant reputational damage and market confidence issues associated with any of those steps that I've just outlined above. They do, unfortunately, lead to very extensive and significant long-term reputational damage. Those points around that, as a result of that, that does mean increased cost of funds. How much? I'm not in a position to tell you, and I'm not in a position to preempt what the market reaction to that might be. It would be quite substantial. It would also result in reduced investor appetite, and unfortunately, in some of those markets, particularly Asia, we would not be able to re-enter that market for a long time. Some of you may remember in New Zealand history the DFC issues. That is still talked about in markets such as that. We would also be required to immediately notify our insurers. Our liability policies expire on the 30th of June, and in fact you will notice an item today around that. Some liability policies would unlikely be renewed if we were in that situation. That does expose not only the elected members but also staff to legal liability without insurance cover to support. The Auditor-General also noted that we would have exposure on significant capital projects. We would have to stop those. We would not have the mandate to commit to that expenditure. Again, the quantum of costs on potential breaches of contract coming from third parties would be quite significant. It would also most likely lead to some legal challenges on the validity of some of our contracts going forward. So, Mr Mayor, it's a summary. I have tried to explain that to you all in quite non-technical terms.
Yep. Look, I really appreciate your work in that front, Sue. It is is the work that I think is important for us to reflect on, to properly understand, and that the public who are here and those who are watching also understand fully the exact nature of the seriousness of what we are dealing with and the responsibilities that we have and the obligations we have to maintain the integrity and the forward progress of this council. So we've had 3 lots of advice, quite black and white. And at the end of the day, the responsibility and obligation sits with us all, actually. But it is a responsibility that we're sharing with 1.5 million people. And while the city goes through a time of extraordinary change and, quite frankly, very rapid transformation and growth, both in population and economics, it also needs to know that its council is stable, is consistent, and is acting within the ambit of its legislative and financial obligations and responsibilities. My reflections to you on hearing those directives and pieces of advice from our officers and Lynn is that we need to proceed today and formalise the LTP. The advice couldn't be any more blunt. And so that's what I am proposing that we do. Now, in amongst the discussions over recent weeks and since the 7th and 8th, also reflected on some of the issues that you've raised. So I have an additional recommendation. Can you just bring that up, please? Just so that we can reflect on the entire body of work, noting the extra work that is required. So let's just look at that quickly. So the letter that's been referred to, signed by 6 people, primarily focused on the fact that we should try and find the cost of any extra work required in transportation from savings we might get from the rail operation. That was it in a nutshell. And I've addressed that matter. The Chief Executive Officer's got a review going. Now, in addressing it, it won't happen overnight. Now, I've discussed this personally with Councillor Mike, who raised it in particular as an issue of concern for himself and was reflected in a resolution. So we've now got that independent review going, and we're going to try and get the results as quickly as we can, but they're certainly not here or now. Secondly, the issue of the level of the transport levy. And that has been an issue of continuing concern and debate. Recognise that, understand it, and clearly there would be work continuing from this day forward. And the work would, if appropriate, include a working party from around this table. And that working party and then would come back with some recommendations for us to work through over the next 3 or 4 months, and could be at the front end of the annual plan proposal as we go into the new annual plan year. One of the proposals coming through from one of your number from Councillor Cam talked a specific number. Well, my view is this: why bind ourselves to a specific number? We need to actually look to see whether or not that number might be lower, might be higher, who knows where it might be. But let's take the opportunity of looking that number in the round rather than constraining ourselves to a number per se. So if we were all working on it, or if there's 4 or 5 of us a part of a working group who would be working on that, then that would be a number that we would agree, rather than try and wrap our present financial optics around it, because as we know, things continue to change. Thirdly, Councillor Christine has raised a number of issues about the significant rate increases that has in different parts of our community. People around this table have different views about that. The issue of the uniform annual general charge and how the revaluation has impacted on us, and whether or not we ought to do a transition or not, those have all been subject to significant debate and discussion and voting. And in fact, it was through the 7th and 8th of May that we actually discussed those issues significantly. And mostly, the various views were confirmed by strong majorities. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue on the work of trying to assess what else is available for us and also deal with a government that really doesn't want to move outside of what we've got at the moment. And Councillor Penny could actually affirm that herself in terms of the work that's been done now through local government in other ways of sustainably funding our council and councillors around New Zealand. Getting hit by revaluations in a city that is growing flat out with diverse valuation increases is murderous for us. It's not what we asked for, but it's absolutely a nature of the legislation we're dealing with. And so whichever way we push our rating system, something else pops out. Whoever takes a loss gets a gain. Someone else gets a gain. So it is a particularly difficult area for us to change significantly. And again, we agreed strongly that we would not put in place a transition for a whole range of reasons. But as you've heard, Councillor Christine, Stephen and his team have a body of work going there, and we will continue to work in beside them to get their advice. The issue of additional revenue sources, and we know that there is a discussion that will go up as a courtesy of Councillor Linda's recommendations in terms of our asset base and how we deal with our asset base and whether or not we're leveraging it strongly enough. All of those issues will go through for a discussion over the next 3 or 4 months. Now, some parts of the chamber don't like that. In fact, they abhor it. Other parts of the chamber think it's the way to go. It's the old story of balancing the very, very diverse needs of us around this chamber and trying to find an even way through, which I've tried to attempt to do at every step of the way. And then finally, a review of Ports of Auckland capital expenditure through Auckland Council investments. We know, given the recent decision, the recent discussions, the future port study, and as we await the outcome of the discussions at the Port Board Day, that we may have to address that. And that can be a part of our continuing review of the LTP as we go forward from this day into the next annual plan and forward. So those, councillors, are the 5 areas where I see going forward we could substantially work together and attempt to address some of the concerns that have been expressed around this table, rather than moving to an option of leaving us without a budget, leaving us without supply. So I've attempted to reflect and bring through the concerns that have been expressed, and also give an indication of my openness to continuing discussion, debate, and also an inclusion of those with the most acute interest in how we deal with some of the continuing challenges that we have. Just some general reflections before we open the floor, and of course any further questions that you might have to our Chief Executive Officer and to the Chief Financial Officer. This has been a long process. We started this in February last year, and through that long process we've engaged a lot with our community. And there have been a couple of issues that the community have been particularly antsy about, but the one that they have been most concerned about is the issue of dealing with transport. And I guess the feedback we got from the community, and you each have your own differing views about that. George has got a notice of motion that reflects his views about motorway network charges and all that. All of those just reflect the fact that we've got a challenge around funding. We're not broke, and we're not in crisis. We have got a challenge. And as I've said to you on a number of occasions, if I could magic up the response, it'd be great. But I can't, because in the end, the work that we need to do to pay for the transport investment is work that hasn't been done for decades, but we're now doing. And we've been doing this now for the last 10, 15 years, and we need to continue it. There are no shortcuts, and it costs money. We are desperately trying to encourage the government to broaden the ambit by which we might derive revenue. and that could be with a motorway network charge, with a regional petrol tax, whatever. We're engaging with them, and the good news is that we've now got a platform to engage formally, and that will be through the Transport Agreement Accord. But to draw them to this table, as has been suggested by Councillor Chris, by generating some type of crisis, by not having supply, I think would be gross irresponsibility on our behalf. We have a clear responsibility now, councillors. The consequences of not taking that responsibility are obvious.